Birchfield Estate Auction, Carver County, Minnesota, a Friday in April. Conrad Hale stood near the back wall with his hands in his jacket pockets and his eyes on a violin case sitting on a folding table at the end of Lot 12. The case was cracked along the spine, the latches oxidized green, the filling visible through a gap where the lid no longer seated flush. 2 dealers had opened it, looked, and set it back down. A woman from the front row had taken a photograph and walked away without bidding. When Conrad raised his number, the room turned. Someone in the 3rd row said it loud enough to carry. "Guy's going to patch it up and sell it at a flea market." The man next to him laughed. A few others joined in the polite, knowing laugh of people who believe they understand something the other person doesn't. Nadia Serrano was standing at the side table with a clipboard and a cup of coffee going cold. She didn't laugh. She watched the man in the back row hold his number steady while the room found its amusement, and she brought the gavel down. Nobody in that room knew that 6 weeks later, the same violin would be standing in the same auction house on a different kind of Friday, and nobody would be laughing. 3 days before the auction, Conrad was at the kitchen table with a bowl of cereal going soft when the Birchfield catalog came through his email. He almost didn't open it. He kept subscriptions to 11 regional estate houses across the upper Midwest, mostly out of habit, the same way he kept a subscription to a woodworking magazine he hadn't read since Claire died. Most weeks he skimmed the listings and moved on. But he opened the attachment. He scrolled past the furniture, the silverware sets, the paintings with water damage, and stopped at Lot 12. The photograph was bad. Someone had taken it under fluorescent light without cleaning the case first, and the image had that flat, washed-out quality that made everything look worse than it was. Conrad set down his spoon and pinched the image open on his phone. He looked at the scroll visible through the F-hole. He looked at it for a long time. Then he put the phone face down on the table and sat there for a moment with his hands flat on the wood. Then he picked the phone back up and looked again. The corner of the scroll, the curl of it, the way the chamfer caught the light, even in a bad photograph. He went to his desk in the back room and printed the image on plain paper and sat under the lamp with it. His daughter Willa was already in bed. He could hear the ceiling fan in her room, turning on the other side of the wall. He called his neighbor, Mrs. Gruber, and asked if she could be at the house by 7 Saturday morning. In the morning, he drove Willa to school in the truck that needed new wiper blades. Willa was in the back seat eating a granola bar and reading something on her phone with the focus of a 12-year-old who had decided mornings were not for conversation. "Where are you going after drop-off?" she asked without looking up. "Auction house. Up in Carver County. For what?" "A violin." She looked up from the phone. "Is it a good one?" Conrad thought about it honestly. "I think it might be something special, but it's been through some things." Willa considered this in the way she considered most things, her father said, quietly and without immediate judgment. "Can it be fixed? That's what I want to find out." She got out at the curb and didn't look back, which was something she'd gotten from him and which he noticed every time. The preview period at Birchfield ran from 8 to 10. Conrad arrived at 8:15 and walked the floor slowly. He went past the furniture first, a break-front cabinet with a missing door, a pair of wingbacks that needed re-upholstering, a grandfather clock that wasn't running. He went past the silver. He went past the paintings. At the end of the room, on a folding table with a paper lot tag taped to the handle, was the case. He circled it once without stopping. Then he crouched down, unlatched it, and lifted the lid. The violin inside was not in playing condition. The bridge was down, 2 strings missing, the sound post had shifted, and there was a crack along the lower bout that someone had attempted to repair with the wrong adhesive. The varnish was worn through at the shoulder. Someone had stored it wrong for a long time, possibly decades, in a place with inconsistent humidity. But the scroll. Conrad pulled a small loop from his jacket pocket and held it to the peg box. He looked at the chamfer work, the fluting, the way the volute transitioned. He looked at the grain on the back through the F-hole, the figure in the maple, the way it ran. He looked at the interior label, which was faded to near illegibility, but not completely. He stood up. He put the loop back in his pocket. He closed the case with both hands carefully and set it back on the table. A man in a sport coat was standing nearby, someone Conrad recognized from the Minnesota Antique Dealers Association, a regular at these sales. The man glanced at Conrad, then at the case, and said something to the woman beside him that included the word optimistic, and they moved on. Conrad didn't follow them. Nadia Serrano was at the side table reviewing her lot sheets when she saw the man in the brown jacket crouch beside lot 12 with a loop. She watched him for a moment. She made a mark on her bidder sheet. Hale, see registration 31. Then she went back to her notes. She wasn't sure why she'd made the mark. She made it anyway. When lot 12 came up, the opening was set at $50. Nadia called for it once, then again. Then a number went up in the back of the room. Conrad held his paddle level. The room turned. There was a pause, and then the comment from the third row, and then the laughter. No other bids came in. Nadia brought the gavel down. When Conrad stepped forward to initial the receipt, she handed him the paperwork without looking up. Then she did look up. He was looking at the case. She looked back down at the paperwork and wrote his number in the column. Conrad got the case home on the passenger seat of the truck, buckled in, which was something Willa made fun of him. For every time she saw him transport an instrument, he brought it into the back room of his house on Aldridge Street, the room Claire had called the studio before she got sick, and before it became the room where Conrad kept tools and order forms, and a space heater that didn't work properly. He had been running a small instrument repair and restoration business. Out of that room for 3 years, just him, working on commissions from schools and orchestras and private collectors across the region. The work paid the bills, if the bills were managed carefully. It did not pay them easily. He set the case on the work table and stood next to it without opening it. Then he called Ezra Bunn. Ezra was 71 years old and had spent 40 years as a luthier and appraiser in the Twin Cities. Before his vision had made the close work impossible, he answered on the second ring. "I need you to look at something," Conrad said. "Can you come over? Can it wait until tomorrow?" "Yes, then I'll be there in an hour." Ezra came in the same way he always did, sat down without being invited, poured himself a coffee from the pot. Conrad kept running all day, and looked at the case. "You buying at Birchfield now? When something's worth it." Ezra unlatched the case with the efficiency of a man who had opened thousands of them. He looked at the violin for a long time. He took the loop Conrad offered and looked at the scroll. He tilted the instrument toward the window and looked at the grain through the F-hole. He looked at the label, what remained of it. He was quiet for a while. "You know what you might have here," he said. It was not a question. "I have a strong suspicion based on the scroll work and the figure in the back. The label's too gone to be definitive, I know, but the chamfering—" Ezra set the loop down. "The chamfering is consistent with the Marcus workshop. Late 19th century, Mittenwald, not Marcourt. You can see it in the heel, too, if you look at the angle." Conrad had already looked at the heel. "If it is what I think," Ezra said slowly, "and if the crack can be properly closed and the instrument put back in playing condition, you're not looking at a flea market find." He paused. "You paid how much?" Conrad told him. Ezra made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. He set the violin back in the case with both hands carefully. "Marcus instruments in this condition, authenticated, have sold between 40 and 80,000 at legitimate auction houses. I've seen one go to 112. He looked at Conrad directly. "You saw it in a photograph. The scroll, the way it caught the light in the F-hole." Ezra nodded slowly. He had known Conrad for 11 years, since Conrad had apprenticed under him after leaving his position as first chair with the St. Paul Chamber Orchestra, the year Claire's diagnosis had made touring impossible. He understood what Conrad could see in a photograph that other people couldn't. "I can't give you an official appraisal," Ezra said. "My certification lapsed when I retired. But I can tell you what I see. That's what I needed." Ezra picked up his coffee. 6 weeks is tight. I know, the crack will take time to do right. I know that too." Ezra looked at him for a moment. "How's Willa?" She asked if the violin could be fixed. Ezra considered this. "Smart kid. She gets it from her mother." The first week was mostly assessment. Conrad spent 3 days taking the instrument apart. In the careful, methodical way you take apart something that's been through damage, not rushing, not assuming. Learning what had been done to it before he could decide what needed to be undone. He cataloged every repair attempt, correct and incorrect. He mapped the crack. He tested the wood density at the seam. He took photographs under raking light and pinned them above the work table in sequence. He ordered hide glue from a supplier in Vermont. He sourced a replacement soundpost from a maker in Chicago he'd worked with before, a man named Feld, who still cut them by hand and would not be hurried. He found a set of appropriate strings through a dealer in New York who specialized in period-correct materials. Willa came to the studio after school on Tuesdays and Thursdays. She'd drop her backpack by the door, spin once on the old desk chair that had been her mother's, and start her homework at the corner of the work table. She didn't interrupt when Conrad was concentrating, which was something she'd learned early, and which he was grateful for every time. After a while she would ask something. "Is it actually valuable?" Conrad was working the clamp on the lower bout seam. "It might be. Like how valuable, depends on what we can confirm." Willa set her pencil down. "Can you at least give me a number? Maybe 40,000, maybe more." Willa was quiet. Then she said, "And you paid $50. "I did." She picked her pencil back up. "That's insane. That's why I looked twice at the photograph." She looked at him over the work table. "Dad, that's actually insane." Conrad laughed. It surprised him, the way his own laughter still sometimes did, how quickly it could arrive when Willa was in the room. On the 8th day, a car pulled up outside that wasn't anyone he recognized. The man who came to the door had a business card from Fairfield Fine Instruments, a regional dealer Conrad knew by reputation, and a client's name behind the pitch that Conrad also recognized. A collector named Bauer who had enough money to send someone to the door before the information was even confirmed. The man offered a number. Conrad said no. The man offered a higher number. Conrad said no again. The man said something about the uncertainty of auction outcomes, about the value of a guaranteed transaction, about saving Conrad the time and the risk. Conrad looked at him. "You don't know what the risk is." "I do." The man left. That evening Conrad received a call from a number he didn't recognize. The caller identified herself as a coordinator from Bauer's office and explained, in a voice calibrated to be pleasant, that her client was very interested in discussing terms. Conrad said he wasn't interested in discussing terms. She said her client was prepared to be generous. Conrad said he was sure of that. Then he ended the call. He stood in the kitchen for a moment. Through the window he could see the backyard where Claire had planted 3 apple trees the spring before her first surgery, which had fruited badly for 2 years, and then spectacularly ever since, which was something she would have said, something specific and characteristic, about, and which he didn't let himself think about for too long. He went back to the studio and put in another 2 hours. Nadia received the call on day 10. She had been at Birchfield for 4 years, long enough to know which buyers were serious and which were performing seriousness, which were informed and which were bluffing. She was good at her job in a way that she'd had to earn, because the auction world in Carver County was old and male, and slow to extend credit it hadn't decided in advance to extend. The man who called her was not Bauer himself but someone who represented him, and the request was framed as routine. Could she confirm any additional documentation that had been provided by the original estate, any provenance materials that might have accompanied Lot 12? Nadia said that information was internal and not available to outside parties post-sale. The man mentioned that Bauer's buying history with Birchfield was significant. Nadia said she understood that and that her answer remained the same. She ended the call. She sat for a moment. Then she opened a new browser window and searched Conrad Hale, Aldridge Street, Instrument Restoration. The website was plain, built cheaply, updated last 2 years ago. A few photographs of completed work, reviews that said things like meticulous, and he gave my daughter's cello another 15 years. She found a brief notice in the St. Paul Chamber Orchestra's archived newsletter from 2014, a farewell to first chair Conrad Hale, departing for family reasons, 12 years with the organization. She closed the window. She didn't close the browser. She pulled up the bidder file and copied the number for his shop to her phone under a name that was just Hale, Lot 12. On day 14 she drove to Aldridge Street. She told him it was a standard post-sale follow-up condition and disposition tracking that Birchfield liked to maintain on specialty lots. It informed their cataloging for future estates. She said it professionally, in a tone that suggested she did this for every buyer, and they both understood that wasn't quite the full explanation, and neither of them commented on it. The studio was small and organized in the particular way that working spaces get organized by someone who knows where everything is without looking. The violin was on the work table, the crack addressed, the seam closed, the instrument beginning to look like something other than what it had been. Conrad walked her through the work without being asked, not performing, just explaining, the way someone explains a thing they understand completely but are describing for the first time to someone standing in the room. She watched his hands when he spoke. They were careful hands. The hands of a man who had spent a long time learning how to hold things correctly. "Do you intend to resell through Birchfield when the work is complete?" she asked. "I haven't decided." She wrote that down. It was the wrong answer in the expected sense, and the right answer in another sense, and that distinction stayed with her on the drive back. At the edge of the driveway she looked back once. He had already turned back to the table. She opened her clipboard and wrote, "Buyer has specialist background, first chair strings." Not a speculator. She stared at what she'd written. Then she underlined the last 3 words without being certain why. Willa was at her grandmother's on the evening of day 19, and the studio was quiet. Conrad sat on the floor with his back against the work table, legs out in front of him, looking at the violin on the bench above. Not despair, not exactly. More like the particular arithmetic of a person accounting for what has been given and what has been taken, and trying to determine whether the ledger was honest. On the shelf above the supply bins, pushed back against the wall between a repair manual and a jar of synthetic resin, was a photograph from 2011. Claire at a rehearsal hall in Minneapolis, standing next to a restored cello Conrad had just completed, the first commissioned restoration he'd sold for a number that had made them both go very still. She had her hand on the shoulder of the instrument and was looking at it rather than the camera, and the expression on her face was not pride exactly, but something adjacent to it, the recognition of a person witnessing someone they love doing the thing they were made to do. She had been the one to tell him to come home. November 2014. Stage 2. Progressing. He had been in the middle of a season with the orchestra, 12 more weeks on the performance calendar, and she had called him on a Wednesday afternoon and said, "I don't need you on that stage. I need you here." He had driven home that night. She died in January 2017. He hadn't gone back to performing. His phone buzzed on the workbench. A message from Nadia, 9:47. She was asking whether he'd received the secondary estate documents Birchfield had forwarded from the original seller's executor. Standard language, the kind of thing that could have waited until morning. He wrote back that he'd received the documents and that the restoration was on schedule. He looked at the message for a moment before he sent it. She hadn't asked about the schedule. 4 minutes later she wrote back, "I know." He set the phone on the bench and didn't look at it again. On day 22, Ezra came back in the afternoon and set a manila envelope on the work table without explaining it. Conrad opened it. Inside was a photocopy of 2 pages from a publication called Strings Heritage Quarterly, Autumn 2007, a feature on the Marcus workshop of Mittenwald, and the identifying characteristics of instruments from the family's late-period output, 1880 to 1905. The article included measured diagrams of scroll chamfer angles, heel geometry, varnish composition analysis from 3 known examples, and interior label typography consistent with the workshop's practice. Ezra picked up his coffee mug. "I didn't bring that," he said, and walked out. Conrad read the article twice. He set it flat on the table and put a clamp on the corner so it wouldn't curl. This was the piece he had been waiting for, not proof, but connection. If he could link the physical characteristics of the instrument to the specifications in this article, and if Nadia could source an independent appraisal from a credentialed strings specialist, the provenance argument could support a proper auction listing, rather than a general estate item sold under ambiguous description. He looked at the calendar. 17 days. He looked at his phone. Nadia's name on the screen. He didn't call. He didn't put the phone away either. 2 days later, Nadia arrived at her office at 8 in the morning and found an email with no sender name and no subject line. A single attachment. Scanned document, 6 pages. The header read, Marcus Workshop, Mittenwald, Verified Export Registry, 1895 to 1908. Against each instrument number, a description, the destination country, and a brief notation of the buyer category, private collector, conservatory, professional ensemble. 1 entry, instrument number MY0114, designation, full-size violin, spruce top, figured maple back. exported to United States, private buyer, Minneapolis, Minnesota, 1903. She read it 3 times. Then she forwarded it to Birchfield's IT administrator and asked for a trace on the sending address. The response came back 2 hours later. Public terminal, Minneapolis Central Library. She sat with that for a while. She pulled the original lot file. She looked at the name of the estate. She called the executor's office and asked about the original family history. The woman on the phone said the family had been in the Minneapolis area for over 100 years, originally German immigrants. Nadia stared at the ceiling for a moment. Then she called Ezra Bunn. He picked up on the 4th ring. She introduced herself. There was a pause. "I'm retired," he said. "I know that, Mr. Bunn. I'm not asking for a certification. I received an interesting document this morning." Another pause. "I can't make disclosures about private clients." "I understand. There are things I can't say in an official capacity." A beat. "But if you wanted to know whether there's a strings specialist in Chicago named Avery Richfield who does independent authentication for auction houses, and who owes me a small favor, I'd have no reason to stop you from looking her up." He hung up. Nadia booked a call with Avery Richfield within the hour. She drove to Aldridge Street that afternoon with no clipboard and no cover explanation prepared. She parked on the street and walked up the drive and knocked. Conrad opened the door. She had her laptop under her arm. She set it on the work table and opened it and turned the screen without saying anything. The export registry entry. The estate history. A preliminary letter from Avery Richfield. 3 paragraphs, noting physical characteristics consistent with Marcus Workshop output and recommending a full in-person assessment. Conrad looked at the screen for a long time. Then he looked at her, not past her, directly at her, which he hadn't done in any of their previous conversations, and which she noticed. "You went looking," he said. "I followed what was there to follow." He was quiet for a moment. Then he told her, not everything, not in sequence, but enough, the shape of it. 12 years with the orchestra. What he could hear in a room when a good instrument was played, and when a lesser one was being managed. The restoration work, which had started as something to do with his hands during hospital waiting rooms, and had become the work he actually did now. Claire. He said her name without softening it, in the matter-of-fact way of a person who has learned that the grief doesn't diminish when you speak carefully around it. Nadia listened. She was good at listening in the professional sense, reading what was said alongside what wasn't. But she was also just listening, without calculating anything, which was different. When he was done, she looked at the violin. The finish was on now. Not shiny, not overworked, the correct matte depth of a properly varnished instrument. The crack was closed and invisible under the correct light. The bridge was new and fitted exactly, and the strings Conrad had sourced were on and tuned. It didn't look like a Lot 12 find from a regional estate sale. It looked like itself. "What will you do with it when Richfield finishes the assessment?" "Return it to where it belongs." She didn't ask what he meant by that. When she left, she stood in the driveway for a moment. She could hear, faintly through the studio window, the sound of the violin. Just a scale. Slow. Testing. The sound of someone determining whether a thing was true. It went up and came back down, and then there was silence, and then it went up again. She stood there longer than she meant to. On the last evening before the auction, Willa was supposed to be at her grandmother's. She was in the studio instead, sitting in the desk chair with her knees pulled up, watching her father tune the violin for the last time. "You're not keeping it," she said. "No. Because of the money." Conrad set the tuner down. "Because it should be played. Instruments that aren't played deteriorate. It needs to go to someone who will use it." Willa thought about this. "Can you play it first, before you sell it?" He looked at her. "Just once," she said. "So it knows it was taken care of." Conrad picked up the violin. He stood in the middle of the studio, which was quiet and small, and had been the room where Claire kept her drafting table. Before the studio became the room where Conrad kept his work. He put the instrument to his chin. He played the opening of the Bach chaconne, not all of it, just the first phrase, slow and without performance, the way you play something when you're not playing for anyone except the room. When he stopped, Willa was very still. "Okay," she said. She got up and kissed him on the cheek and went to get her bag, and he stood there with the violin at his side and did not put it down for a while. At 9:15 that evening, Nadia called. She had spent the better part of a week on it. Avery Richfield had completed her in-person assessment and delivered a 4-page report, careful and precise, stating that the instrument bore characteristic consistent with Marcus Workshop output, Mittenwald, circa 1900, that provenance documentation was partial but credible, that the restoration was of exceptional quality, and that the instrument was fully playable and appropriate for professional use. Birchfield would list it with full disclosure, attributed to Marcus Workshop, Mittenwald, circa 1900, provenance partially documented, independent assessment completed. Not Christie's language, not guaranteed attribution, but transparent and honest, and more than most regional houses would have done. Conrad listened to all of it. Then he asked, "Will Bauer cause any problems for you if you list it through Birchfield?" A pause. The first question in 6 weeks he had asked about her rather than the instrument. "Probably," she said. "That's my concern." She heard him exhale slowly on the other end. Not dramatic, just a man absorbing information. "The assessment was done right," he said. "Yes, then it'll hold." There was a short silence that wasn't uncomfortable. "Conrad, yeah, why did you call Ezra Bunn the night of the auction instead of going to someone closer?" A pause. "Because Ezra taught me how to see what I see. He was the one who told me, the first time I brought him a repair job after I left the orchestra, that what I was doing with my hands was not a consolation prize, that it was the actual work." Nadia didn't answer immediately. She wrote something on the notepad by her phone, then she crossed it out. "I'll see you Friday," she said. "Yeah." She hung up and sat at her desk for a while, without turning on the overhead light. The Friday sale at Birchfield was attended differently than its usual crowds. The parking lot had cars from outside the county. A buyer from Chicago had registered the previous day. 2 representatives from a conservatory in Madison's were in the 4th row with their paddles already filled out. Nadia had listed the violin 5 days earlier with the full write-up, the Richfield assessment, the export registry entry, high-resolution photographs under raking light, the article from Strings Heritage Quarterly. She had also included a brief note about the restoration itself, 1 paragraph, describing the work completed and the background of the restorer. Bauer's coordinator had called twice that week. Nadia hadn't picked up either time. At 10:20 the violin was brought to the front of the room in its case, which Conrad had also repaired, the lid reseated, the latches replaced with period-correct hardware he'd sourced from a supplier in Vienna. Nadia opened the case herself. She took the violin out and held it for a moment for the room to see. The room went quiet in the way rooms go quiet when the thing in front of them is actually what was promised to be. She set it on the display stand and called the opening at $8,000. 4 paddles went up immediately. Within 5 minutes the room was at $38,000 and thinning. By 8 minutes it was the Chicago buyer and the Madison Conservatory representative, back and forth with the focused patience of 2 parties who had both decided they needed to win. 42, 46, 50,000. The Chicago buyer paused at 52, and Nadia watched the room the way she'd learned to watch it. Reading the stillness, reading the energy behind the stillness. She found Conrad near the side door. Same place he had stood 6 weeks ago. The Friday the room laughed. He hadn't consigned the instrument through Birchfield's standard process. He'd worked out the terms with Nadia directly. Seller's consignment, full transparency on provenance, minimum reserve set low. He was just watching. The conservatory representative raised her paddle. 55,000. The Chicago buyer sat with his paddle on his knee. He looked at the instrument on the stand. He set his paddle down. Nadia gave the room its 10 seconds. 55,000 going once. The room was still. Going twice. She brought the gavel down. The room broke into applause. Nadia wrote the figure on her sheet and signed her name. When she looked up, Conrad was looking at her across the room. Not smiling. Just looking, with the direct, steady quality of a man who had said what he needed to say without speaking. She looked back at her paperwork. Something had shifted. She could not have said precisely when it began. The crowd thinned over the next 40 minutes. Conrad signed the settlement papers at the side table. After Birchfield's commission, 46,000 and some change landed in an account that had been running on careful arithmetic for 3 years. He stood in the hallway and looked at the number on the form. It wasn't the number that moved him. It was the fact of it. The proof that what he had seen in a bad photograph at his kitchen table on an ordinary evening had been real, that seeing it had meant something, that the work had been worth doing because the work was honest. Bauer's representative came through the hallway. A few minutes later, the coordinator, the same woman who had called twice and hadn't been answered, she stopped in front of Conrad. She looked at him with the expression of someone completing a calculation that hadn't gone the way they'd planned. "The conservatory will use it," she said, not unkindly. "I know," Conrad said. "That's why I held the reserve where I did." She looked at him for a moment. Then she nodded once and moved on. Nadia found him near the main door holding the settlement envelope. "You didn't tell me you were first chair," she said. "You didn't ask. I searched your name." "I know." She stopped. "When did you know I had?" He looked at her. "The first time you came to the studio. You asked about the varnish composition on the top, and you asked it using the correct terminology for a Mittenwald instrument, specifically. That's not in a general reference." She held his gaze. It was a specific kind of look. The expression of a person who was used to being the one who had done the research, couching someone who had noticed before she'd said a word. She didn't have a quick answer. That was unusual for her. The main door opened and Willa came in at a run, one strap of her backpack hanging off her shoulder, Conrad's mother-in-law right behind her in a coat that was still being buttoned. Willa went straight to her father. "What did it sell for?" "Enough." She narrowed her eyes. "Enough for what?" "New wiper blades. Maybe a trip somewhere." Willa weighed this with the seriousness of a 12-year-old. "Somewhere good, or somewhere educational." "Your choice." This appeared to satisfy her. She turned and looked at Nadia with the frank, uncomplicated directness of a child who had no reason to be anything other than honest. "You're the one who sold my dad's violin." "I held the gavel," Nadia said. Willa thought about this seriously. "But you also went and found all the proof. That's most of the work." Conrad looked at Nadia, and the armor that had been there in every previous conversation was not there. He smiled. 3 weeks later, there was a different instrument on the work table, a viola with a seam separation and a fingerboard that needed replacing. Bread and butter work, a commission from a high school orchestra director in Duluth who had driven it down herself and said the students had been sharing it for 2 years. Conrad was under good light at the table when he heard a car in the drive that wasn't anyone he expected. He recognized the sound of her footsteps on the front walk before she knocked. Nadia came in without waiting for a second invitation, which she had apparently stopped doing. She had nothing with her. No clipboard, no professional purpose she'd prepared an explanation for. She stood in the middle of the studio in her coat and looked at the viola on the table. "The conservatory played the violin for the first time yesterday," she said. "Their programs coordinator sent me a recording. I heard." She looked at him. "They sent it to you first. Ezra forwarded it." He cried a little. He'd never admit it. Nadia looked at the viola. "What's this one?" "Seam separation. New fingerboard. Student instrument. How long?" "A week if I don't rush the glue." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "Birchfield got a new estate consignment yesterday. An old house in Stillwater. The preliminary inventory included a box of items described as household miscellany, musical." She paused. "I haven't opened the box yet." Conrad set down the tool he was holding. "I thought," Nadia said carefully, "that if there was something in it worth looking at, you'd want to be there when I open it." He looked at her for a moment, the way he looked at things when he was deciding whether they were what they appeared to be. "When?" he said. "Tomorrow morning. If you can get someone for Willa." "I can." She didn't move toward the door. Neither did he. The studio was quiet in the way it was quiet when work was resting and nothing needed to be done immediately, a suspended kind of quiet, the space between one thing ending and something else not yet named. "Will you stay for dinner?" he asked. "Willa's making something." I use the term loosely. Nadia's expression shifted in a way that was small and specific, and that she didn't try to manage. "Yes," she said. She took off her coat. She hung it on the hook by the door, the hook that had been empty for 3 years. And didn't comment on where she'd put it, and neither did he. The late light came through the studio window at the low angle that April light takes in Minnesota when the day is turning, and the cold is finally, reluctantly, beginning to give. It lay across the workbench and the tools, and the viola waiting patiently for the week of careful work ahead, and it reached the floor where 2 shadows stretched longer than the people who made them, which was, in its quiet way, the only thing left to say.